Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. Today we're going to continue looking at all of the subclasses in the Apocalyptic Unearthed Arcana that was released a few weeks ago. We've already taken a look at the Gladiator Fighter as well as the Circle of Preservation Druid. I'll put those actually down in a playlist down below, so if you haven't seen those yet, you can kind of go back and watch my opinions, kind of reviews of those. Today we're going to be looking at the next one on the list, which is the Defiled Sorcery Sorcerer. There's not really much else to cover, so let's just go ahead and get right into it. Again, as always, starting with the summary, and as always, again, we start with the summary because in 2024 the summary has been doing a really good job of foreshadowing what the class is supposed to be about, so I like to read it and make some guesses as to what I think the subclass is going to do, because again, I look at one section at a time when I'm making these slides. So for the Defiled Sorcery Sorcerer, it says that they siphon life into catastrophic spells. Your innate power siphons life essence from the surrounding world. At your command, creatures grow sick and plants wither to husks. You draw power from the corruption of life itself, draining vitality to fuel destructive magic. When I first read through this one, I kind of read through it multiple times. I found it kind of surprisingly non-specific. Usually there's a few things that will jump out at me as to like, oh, this is what the subclass is going to do. I can expect things like this and this and that. I found this one surprisingly, again, non-specific. I couldn't really draw anything immediately from it. No real strong first impressions. Clearly, that's sort of a necromancy theme subclass, and based on historical precedent with the Reanimator Artificers, I'm expecting a better necromancer than the necromancy wizard, especially the last one that we saw in the Wizard Unearthed Arcana from a few months ago. If I had to make any guesses here, we have the phrase creatures grow sick. I might expect some maybe interactions with the poisoned condition, something along those lines. Kind of repeats a theme of using life energy to fuel your power to make your spells more destructive. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like. I would expect some sort of like reaping mechanic where like if a creature dies near you, you can like restore some of your sorcery points, or like get like a whatever the next spell on your turn can use a meta magic for free, something along those lines. Some sort of reaping mechanic. Don't know what that'll exactly look like. This repeated siphon life into catastrophic spells, draining vitality into fuel destructive magic. That's clearly some sort of thing that would probably be happening in the subclass. I don't really have any expectation of any like sort of zombies or summons or skeletons of any kind. This is very clearly a necromancy themed subclass, but there's no allusion here to any sort of summons or creatures. If there's a subclass spell list, I'm probably expecting it to mainly just be full of necromancy spells, particularly blaster type spells like Blight, of course. Vampiric Touch would probably also be on there, possibly. If they want to bring in a spell from Strixhaven, they could bring in Wither and Bloom. I think that works really well with this theme of subclass. You know, there is a mention of destructive magic here, so I could see possibly a secondary focus on evocation magic, but I'm not quite sure on that one. Before I go further, I am a little surprised that this sort of theme of subclass is being tied to the sorcerer. Again, even in the summary, we're just seeing like plants wither, drawing power from nature and the surrounding world, the life essence of basically everything around you. And so this idea of like a blighter subclass in my head has always belonged to the druid. I know that Critical Role released a Circle of the Blighted subclass for their world, but even before that, like in the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide, they had the villainous subclasses. That was the Oathbreaker Paladin and the Death Domain Cleric. And so in my head, I was always wondering, okay, what would the villainous subclasses look like for every class? And like a blighter druid, a druid that like corrupts nature would kind of be what I would imagine would fill that gap. In terms of like officially released subclasses, the Circle of Spores kind of does that, but I don't think it really hits the villainous vibes as well as like something that is actually corrupting nature would. But again, that is just the summary. Let's go ahead and get into the actual features of this subclass, starting with the sort of key feature of the Defiler, and that is a feature called Defile and Empower. It says once per turn, when you roll damage for a spell you cast using a spell slot, you can siphon your life energy into the spell and empower it. Roll a number of your unexpended hit dice up to a number equal to half the level of the spell slot expended. Rounded up, notably it's rounding up here. Normally you round down by default, but you're rounding up in this situation. Add the total rolled to one damage roll of the spell. Those hit dice are then expended. It has a secondary sub feature called Lifesteal. It says instead of drawing on your own life force when you use this feature, you can try to steal life from another creature you can see within 30 feet of yourself. That creature then makes a Constitution saving throw against your spell save DC. Creatures that have immunity to the exhaustion condition automatically succeed on the save. On a failed save, in place of rolling your hit point dice, roll a number of the creature's unexpended hit point dice up to a number equal to half the level of the spell slot expended, rounded down, minimum of 1 die. You then add that total roll to 1 damage roll of the spell, and those hit point dice are expended for the creature. Once a creature fails its save against the lifesteal, you can't use lifesteal again until you finish a long rest. Unless you expend 3 sorcery points, no action required to restore your use of it. There's a lot going on here, but in general, you're basically, when you roll damage for a spell that you cast using a spell slot, you spend some of your hit die by and then rolling them and then adding that damage to 1 damage roll of the spell spell, or you can have the creature make a Constitution saving throw, and if they fail it, then you can expend their hit die to do it. So this feature also came with a design note regarding hit point dice for creatures, basically just telling you where to find the hit point dice in the stat block. And then the bottom line here is kind of the most important here, where it says when a monster is first encountered, assume that it hasn't expended any of its hit dice. I mean, DMs of course can make any exceptions there. If it's like the enemies are another adventuring party who've been going on their own adventuring day, of course they probably expended some of their hit die to recover during that day. But generally speaking, if it's just a monster in the wild that hasn't had any rough encounters that day, they probably haven't expended any of their hit die. One thing that kind of jumped out to me at first here is that it is not limited to the sorcerer's hit die. So if you multi-class into a class that has a bigger hit die, since the sorcerer only has a d6, so like if you're doing your Sorlock or a Sorkadin, which has, you know, the Warlock has a d8, the Paladin has a d10, that you can use their hit die if you want to add more damage to your spells beyond the d6. Again, it only does apply to one damage roll of the spell, such as if you're casting a Scorching Ray, it's only going to add damage to one of the rays, whereas if you do it on a Fireball, the Fireball is just one roll of damage to begin with. That extra damage would affect all of the creatures. I think another thing worth noting is that this is probably Wizards of the Coast's answer to the whole sorcerers should be a con caster discussion. I don't know if I've ever actually like covered that in the past, but I've always found that a little too extreme. But every time that discussion makes its rounds, I'm always like, they shouldn't use con, but they should be able to use their hit die as a resource. That way they're trading more power now for less recovery later. And so when I first read the summary and it's talking about using life force to empower your spells, that was the first thing that actually came to my head. In the summary, it talks about the life force of other things around you, not specifically yourself. So I didn't think that it would be sacrificing your own hit die to empower your spells, but I'm not actually surprised to see it in a feature now. And I think you do have to kind of work these numbers correctly, make sure that you're not really nerfing the sorcerer by making them unable to recover more later. So we'll have to see how that pans out in later features, if at all. But I think at long last, maybe this will help kind of die down the discussions that always come up about sorcerers being a con caster. They would at least now have one subclass that sort of works that way. I do think that the lifesteal ability is pretty cool as well. It's guaranteed to work basically at least once. I can't quite tell if the creature succeeds if you still have to expend your hit die or if you can choose not to empower it at that point. It does say on a failed save, in place of rolling your hit point dice, roll a number of the creature's unexpended hit points. So it says in place of. So you have to already be choosing to empower, possibly using your own hit dice, and then choose to try to lifesteal instead. That's not super clear. I feel like you are supposed to expend your hit point dice if they still succeed, but that isn't super clear. I'd like some more clarification on that. This doesn't work on creatures that are immune to exhaustion, and immunity to exhaustion isn't super common. It's only on like 79 creatures within the new 2025 monster manual, and that's across all CRs. However, it is limited to very specific kinds of creatures for the most part, so you'll probably figure that out via trial and error as to what kind of creatures are and are not immune to exhaustion. You know, one more thing that's actually pretty cool about the lifesteal ability is that you can possibly use hit die sizes that are beyond what are available to players. Of course, the highest hit die size available to a player is a d12 for a barbarian. You're probably not going to be multiclassing into a barbarian with a sorcerer, so you might be limited to a d10 if you're multiclassing into paladin. But there are some monsters in the game that use a d20 for their hit die, so if you manage to use the lifesteal successfully on them, then you're rolling a d20 on the extra damage for this feature, which is potentially a lot more damage than you can normally get otherwise. So that's actually pretty exciting and would lead to some really fun moments at the table. So that is the sort of bread and butter feature for this subclass. There, of course, is a Defiler spell list, so let's go ahead and take a look at that one. So again, at level 3, we get our subclass spell list. At level 3, you get Blindness, Deafness, Inflict Wounds, Ray of Enfeeblement, and Ray of Sickness. Level 5 gives you Bestow Curse and Vampiric Touch. At level 7, you get Blight and Hallucinatory Terrain. And then at level 9, finally, you get Anti-Life Shell and Contagion. So there's not really a whole lot of surprises on this subclass spell list. Again, I was expecting just a very large amount of Necromancy spells. Inflict Wounds is an interesting one. Inflict Wounds is it's less fun, I guess, in 2024. I think it's technically stronger on average, but the change in 2024 with Inflict Wounds is that it is now a saving throw instead of a spell attack. Basically means that it can no longer crit. The damage was also reduced from 3d10 to 2d10. However, it always does damage. It is a save for half, so it basically can never miss like the original one could. That's why I'm saying it's probably on average better than the original. I haven't actually worked the numbers out on that, but it is never not going to do damage, whereas if you missed with the melee spell attack, then it does no damage in the first place. But we're just going to miss those juicy and inflict wounds crits, because those were always really fun when that happened. Bestow Curse is something that I kind of thought about. Again, when I read the original summary, it talked about the creatures growing sick, and in 2024 there are no more diseases, so it couldn't be diseases, but basically there's poisons and what they refer to as magical contagions. Typically, magical contagions are basically just curses of various kinds. But when it comes to curses in terms of the spells that players have access to, there's only like 2 spells that are technically considered curses, and by that I mean they can be removed by the spell remove curse. Bestow Curse is one of them, so it makes sense that it's here. However, I just wasn't sure when I was reading the summary if they felt like Bestow Curse, and I think the other one is Gesh or Geas or whatever you pronounce that. I think that one is also considered a curse. But I didn't really feel like either of those necessarily hit the growing sick theme very well, but I'm not really surprised to see Bestow Curse here. Hallucinatory Terrain, I think, is maybe the only one that seems a little bit out of place. You know, it is an illusion spell, so you could technically flavor it to fit the theme of this subclass in one way or another, but nothing so far has really suggested that illusions are sort of a secondary focus of this subclass. This might just be due to not having a lot of spells that fit in this sort of subclass theme, but I do think there are some, like Death Ward I think stands out as well. That would be a good one. Sickening Radiance even, I think, even though it's radiant damage, and that kind of goes against the whole like necromancy, necrotic damage sort of vibe that's going on here. Sickening Radiance has always been to me like Chernobyl like radiation, and that's why it's Sickening Radiance. Even though this subclass probably is not a summon based subclass, there's the Spirit of Death spell, which is at 4th level. This is a summon spell from the Book of Many Things. I do think that they have some options if they feel like Hallucinatory Terrain is maybe not hitting quite as well with the subclass. I do think that they're trying to avoid putting too many damaging spells. Like they don't want to just put a bunch of like fireballs and, you know, big blasty spells on one spell list. They want to have utility spells for some balance, which is why I think something like Death Ward fits very easily here. And then Anti-Life Shell is something that I wouldn't have guessed, but makes perfect sense because it keeps out basically anything living. If you're not a construct or not undead, then you cannot enter this emanation that is around the sorcerer. So that's pretty cool too. Those are the level 3 features. Let's go ahead and move on to level 6, where we have a feature called Corrupted Caster. This one says you learn further ways to tap into the corrupting magic within yourself, granting you the following benefits. First, you have Defiler's Ward. When you take a bonus action to trans sorcery points into a spell slot, you can wreath your body in a protective web of defiling energy. Roll a number of d6s equal to the level of the spell slot created. You gain a number of temporary hit points equal to the total rolled. If a creature hits you with a melee attack roll while you have temporary hit points, the creature takes necrotic or poison damage your choice equal to your charisma modifier. Then there's a secondary sub-feature called Strengthened Rot. Damage dealt by your sorcerer spells and sorcerer features ignores resistance to necrotic and poison damage. So this is what I was talking about originally when I was talking about features that would offset the lack of recovery that you get from using the level 3 feature, the first one where you can sacrifice your hit die to empower the damage of your spells. So here, when we use our sorcery points to recreate a spell slot, we can give ourselves a bunch of temporary hit points. That doesn't really cost anything extra. Again, we're already just using a bonus action to recreate a spell slot. So this is basically just all upside. We're not only getting the spell slot from converting sorcery points into a spell slot, but then we're also getting more temporary hit points just based on a number of d6s. Like those d6s aren't coming from anywhere. They're just essentially free. Additionally, there's the reflected damage while we have temporary hit points. That's basically like a do-it-yourself Armor of Agathis sort of effect. And it would also stack with Armor of Agathis if you had that spell from a different source, because notably within the description, at least as it's written within this Unearthed Arcana, it says while you have temporary hit points, not while you have temporary hit points from this feature. So you can have temporary hit points from anywhere, whether it's, you know, like an Armor of Agathis spell, polymorph, or any of the subclass features from other classes that allow you to grant temporary hit points to an ally. So there's a lot of potential value that you could get out of the Defiler's Ward, even if you're not specifically always using a bonus action to create a new spell slot with your sorcery points. As long as you have temporary hit points from anywhere, you will still get that sort of thorns damage going out on creatures who hit you with a melee attack. Strengthened Rot is fine, you know, being able to ignore necrotic resistance or poison resistance on creatures with your sorcerer spells, you know, and that's never a bad thing, of course. But of course, the caveat with ignoring poison resistance is the same as it's always been since 2014, that most creatures that have any sort of defense against poison are typically just immune to it. There are very, very, very few creatures that are resistant to poison damage. Most of them are just immune. And that immunity really just comes from common sense, where, I mean, like constructs, for example, they can't be poisoned. They're not living creatures, so it doesn't make sense for them to be able to be poisoned. So I don't think that necessarily that needs to change, where there are so many creatures that are straight up immune to poison and then immune to poison damage. But if they want to have features like this that ignore resistance to poison damage, but, you know, the vast majority of creatures that have defense against poison are immune to it instead, that they just treat immunity then as resistance, so that even though they still can't have the poisoned condition, then they at least get half damage from receiving poison damage. They are just straight up immune to it. That way features like this are actually useful when they come up. And again, that wouldn't be specific to this subclass. That would be with any feature that grants the ability to ignore resistance to poison damage. That is the level 6 feature. Let's go ahead and move on to level 14, where we have something called Withering Aura. Withering Aura says when you use your innate sorcery, an aura of defiling magic fills a 15-foot emanation originating from you while your innate sorcery is active. This grants you the following benefits. First, we have Defiling Shroud. It says when an enemy within the aura hits you with an attack roll, you can reduce that attack's total damage against you. The reduction equals your charisma modifier. Secondly, you have Essence Siphon. It says when an enemy dies within your aura, you gain 1d4 sorcery points. Once you use this benefit, you can't regain sorcery points this way again until you use innate sorcery again. So innate sorcery, of course, is sort of the we call it like the Sorcerer's Rage like feature. They get it early on. So this is kind of building off of that feature. But as far as the damage reduction goes, it's not much, especially at level 14. But again, this is just another thing that is helping offset the lack of recovery from sacrificing your hit die to empower your spells through that Defile and Empower feature. And I think it's also worth noting that depending on what your con modifier is, the 5 damage, assuming that you have a +5 to your charisma, reducing that damage from each attack within the aura will probably be around the same amount of health on average that you might be getting from rolling a hit die during a short rest, for example, because you have a d6 hit die. If you have like a, maybe a +2 to your constitution, you'd be recovering around, 5 to 6 hit points on average from that rolling that hit die. So while reducing 5 damage from each attack isn't a whole lot, especially with the way that damage scales, it kind of works out even if it's not perfect. And then the Essence Siphon feature is basically exactly what I was expecting when it comes to having a reaping feature where, when a creature dies around you, you can restore some of your sorcery points. And notably, this is actually very good with the Sorcery Incarnate feature that the base class gets at level 7, where it says if you have no uses of innate sorcery left, you can choose to activate it if you spend 2 sorcery points when you take the bonus action to activate it. And so as long as a creature is dying within that radius while you're using that activation of innate sorcery, you have a 75% chance to at least break even, if not come out ahead, because you spent 2 sorcery points to activate it. You're rolling a d4 to get a number of sorcery points back, and you can either roll a 2, 3, or 4 and at least break even, if not come out ahead. That makes this extremely efficient, and that's just a really kind of nice little synergy with this subclass. So that is the level 14 feature. Let's go ahead and move on to the capstone. This one is called Superior Defiler. It says you've perfected your ability to control and channel defiling magic, granting you the following benefits. First, you have Fouled Soul. It says you have immunity to the poisoned and exhaustion conditions. And then secondly, you have Further Defilement. It says the size of your withering aura increases to 30-foot emanation. In addition, enemies can't regain hit points while in your aura. So first things first, immunities are never bad, although they are kind of situational. And also notably that it is immunity to the poisoned condition, not immunity to poison damage. Sometimes taking poison damage is tied to having the poison condition, but not always. The doubling of the size of the withering aura from 15 feet to 30 feet, I think that adds a lot of quality of life to that feature. And then again, preventing enemies from regaining hit points while in your aura is situationally useful. It works really well with the Mutilate feature, I believe it was, from the Gladiator Fighter. That's their capstone, where they have like a severe penalty, and that penalty is basically permanent until that creature regains hit points. And so if you're able to keep them in your aura, even if they have the ability to regain hit points, they won't be able to do so while within the Withering aura. As far as a capstone goes, I do feel like this maybe feels a little underwhelming, although I do think that the immunities here are taking up a lot of the budget of this feature, so to speak. So when like the poison condition does come up, when the exhaustion condition does come up, this feature will be, of course, super powerful. But overall, I don't think that this is the most exciting feature for this subclass. I think the level 14 feature is probably my favorite one so far. I do think that the immunity to exhaustion does have a lot of potential, because even if there aren't a lot of monsters that have the ability to inflict exhaustion, even if there aren't a lot of environmental ways being imposed upon you that would inflict the exhaustion condition, the ability to use immunity to exhaustion proactively as a player to do things that would normally result in giving myself exhaustion if I were a normal class are things that I could ignore, like staying awake for a long period of time, not eating food or drinking water for a particular amount of time. If there is a way to use the ability to not gain exhaustion to your benefit, this subclass, of course, would then have that ability to do that, because exhaustion is one of those mechanics where it's like it's meant to be a limit on how long you can do certain things, but that is sort of a ceiling that this subclass is able to break through. So that then brings us to our final question. Is the Defiler good? And I would say this is probably another necromancy themed subclass that is just objectively better than the necromancy wizard. I do think that overall this is a very solid subclass. Again, hit die as a resource on the sorcerer has been a long time coming. The whole con sorcerer debate has been going on for years and years and years. I think using hit die as a resource is the appropriate compromise to that. I think overall this looks very good on paper. Again, the biggest concern when you're creating a class that uses hit die as a resource is not completely nerfing them to the point where they gave up all of their ability to recover during short rests, and now they're just kind of very, very squishy. They need to have some way to offset that recovery and the temporary hit points that they can get when they create a spell slot from their sorcery points, as well as the damage reduction that they get in the Withering Aura. I think at least seem like they would offset that, just based on the comparison of, what you could theoretically gain from rolling your hit dice versus the damage reduction that you're getting from these spells. It's not exactly one for one, but it seems like it should be enough to mostly offset the lack of recovery. This can also be aided, of course, just by making sure that when you are empowering your spells using your own hit die, that you're doing so when you're pretty confident that it's going to remove one or more enemies from the board, and thereby, reducing the incoming damage to your party, if not directly to you. So again, overall, I think this is a very well put together subclass. I would be very excited to play this one. But again, just as a fan of the wizard class in general, it just leaves me wondering what Wizards of the Coast can do with the wizard at this point. This is assuming that they even received largely negative feedback regarding their revision of the Necromancy Wizard in the previous Unearthed Arcana. I would imagine so. I think Wizards of the Coast has done a great job with the Reanimator Artificer, and now here with the Defiler Sorcerer. And I will say that I do think that it's probably easier to design for the Artificer and the Sorcerer, because these classes have more moving parts, more features upon which that a subclass can very easily build upon. For example, the Sorcerer has innate sorcery. They have like the ability to create and spend sorcery points. There's a lot of moving parts within the Sorcerer to build upon with your subclass features, whereas the Wizard doesn't really have much to go off of. Like, they get a spell book, which is kind of a feature, and they kind of tried to do that in the Unearthed Arcana revision. I don't really think that worked out very well. They have Ritual Adept, which is very generic. I don't think you can really build around that. Arcane Recovery, that's a once per long rest thing. It's very hard to build around that. They have Memorize Spell now at level 5, but again, that's not really doing anything. So the base class Wizard is basically a blank slate. Seems like Wizard of the Coast is sort of struggling to find like a through line in the Wizard upon which they can build a proper Necromancer as a Necromancer Wizard. It is pretty clear that from the Reanimator Artificer and from this Defiler Sorcerer that they can do Necromancy well. They just need to find what that is supposed to look like for a Wizard. But again, that's just my opinion. I would love to know what you all think, specifically mostly about the Defiler Sorcerer here. But what direction do you think Wizard of the Coast should go when it comes to Necromancy with the Wizard? It's clear that they can do it well. They just need to find that really cohesive theme for the Wizard as to how a Wizard would approach the subject of Necromancy. So go down to those comments and let me know what you think below. And again, while you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you are a new viewer or a returning viewer to this channel and you like what you saw here and you want to see more from me, please consider hitting that subscribe button and support the channel. I release videos every Wednesday, so you always have something to look forward to. I appreciate your time, and I'll see you in the next one.